In the last video, we talked about dimensionality reduction for the purpose of compressing the data. In this video, I'd like to tell you about a second application of dimensionality reduction, and that is to visualize the data. For a lot of machine learning applications, it really helps us to develop effective learning algorithms if we can understand our data better, if we have some way of visualizing the data better. And so dimensionality reduction offers us often another useful tool to do so. Let's start with an example. Let's say we've collected a large data set of many statistics and facts about different countries around the world. So maybe the first feature, X1, is the country's GDP, or the gross domestic product. X2 is the per capita, meaning the per person GDP. X3, human development index, life expectancy. X5, X6, and so on. And we may have a huge data set like this with, maybe 50 features for every country, and we may have a huge set of countries. So is there something that we can do to try to understand our data better? So given this huge table of numbers, how do you visualize this data? If you have 50 features, it's very difficult to plot 50-dimensional data. So what is a good way to examine this data? Using dimensionality reduction, what we can do is, instead of having each country represented by this feature vector xi, which is 50-dimensional, so instead of, say, having a country like Canada, instead of having 50 numbers to represent the features of Canada, let's say we can come up with a different feature representation that is these z vectors that is in R2. If that's the case, if we can have just a pair of numbers, z1 and z2, that somehow summarizes my 50 numbers, maybe what we can do is then plot these countries in R2 and use that to try to understand the space and these sorts of features of different countries a little bit better. And so here, what you can do is reduce the data from 50 dimensions to 2D, so we can plot this as a two-dimensional plot. And when you do that, it turns out that if you look at the output of the dimensionality reduction algorithms, it usually doesn't ascribe a particular meaning to these new features z1 and z2. And it's often up to us to figure out roughly what these features means. But if you plot what these features, here's what you might find. So here, every country is represented by a point zi, which is in R2. And so each of those dots in this figure represents a country. And so here's z1 and here's z2. And highlight a couple of these. So we might find, for example, that the horizontal axis, the z1 axis, corresponds roughly, to the overall country size, or the overall economic activity of a country. So the overall GDP, overall economic size of a country. Whereas the vertical axis in our data might correspond to the per person GDP, or the per person well-being, or the per person economic activity. And you might find that given these 50 features, these are really the two main dimensions of variation. And so out here, you might have a country like the USA, which is a relatively large GDP, it's a very large GDP, and a relatively high per person GDP as well. Whereas here, you might have a country like Singapore, which actually has a very high per person GDP as well, but because Singapore is a much smaller country, the overall economy size of Singapore is much smaller than the US. And over here, you would have countries where individuals are sort of unfortunately somewhat less well off, maybe shorter life expectancy, less healthcare, less economic activity, as well as smaller countries. Whereas a point like this would correspond to a country that has a substantial amount of economic activity, but where individuals tend to be somewhat less well off. But so you might find that the axes z1 and z2 can help you to more succinctly capture really what are the two main dimensions of variations amongst different countries, such as the overall economic activity of a country, reflected by the size of the country's overall economy, as well as the per person individual well-being measured by per person GDP, per person healthcare, and things like that. So that's how you can use dimensionality reduction in order to reduce data from 50 dimensions or whatever down to 2 dimensions or maybe down to 3 dimensions so that you can plot it and understand your data better. In the next video, we'll start to develop a specific algorithm called PCA, or Principal Components Analysis, which will allow us to do this and also do the earlier application I talked about of compressing the data.